Last week, the draft withdrawal agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union was published to heated political and public debate. In light of its importance, I have been asked to make this statement in order to set out for honourable members and the public the key elements of the draft withdrawal agreement. I am grateful that you have agreed that I may do so. The withdrawal agreement is very long and detailed. It has 585 pages of legal text. Its key features are, however, relatively straightforward. It sets out how the process of the UK's withdrawal from the EU is to be conducted. It covers the period from when the United Kingdom ceases to be a member state of the European Union at 11 p.m. on the 29th of March 2019 until the end of the so-called transition period on the 31st of December 2020. The agreement is necessary because the UK has been a member state since 1973 and its laws have become intertwined with those of the European Union. It is the case, therefore, that EU law and treaty provisions govern many aspects of UK life. Reaching an agreement has not, therefore, been straightforward. Discussions have also been complemented by the UK's and the European Union's pre-declared positions. The UK determined that it did not wish to remain in the EU customs union nor in the single market, and it also did not wish to see the creation of a hard border in Ireland. The EU similarly made its own position clear in that it refused to discuss the future UK-EU relationship until the terms of the withdrawal agreement had been concluded. The EU therefore stated that before looking to the future, satisfactory progress had to be made on its own priority issues, which were citizens' rights, the financial settlement and the Irish border, and more specifically, avoiding a hard border. In December last year, the European Commission negotiating team, led by Michel Barnier, determined that sufficient progress had been made at that point in order to progress onto discussions of the future relationship. They had by that stage reached a point where much of the content of the agreement had been settled, in principle, but they were only able to progress beyond that stage by including a backstop or fallback position in relation to the Irish border. This was because the two sides had not managed to reach an agreed position where the creation of a hard border could be avoided. However, it is good practice to continue to progress those areas where agreement has been reached, whilst continuing to try and reach agreement in the more difficult areas. So the UK was able to bring forward its proposals for the future relationship, and these were eventually clarified and set out in its white paper, which became known as the Chequers Plan. Mr. President, it may seem odd in a statement covering the withdrawal agreement to take this backward look. But I think we need to do that, just that in order to understand how we have arrived where we are today. The contentious issue is, of course, the backstop arrangement, and I will cover that. But first I would like to outline some of the other areas of the agreement and give consideration as to how they impact the Isle of Man. On the whole, and as we have said many times, the Isle of Man is not a member of the European Union and is not included within the UK's membership of the EU either. We are not, therefore, withdrawing from the EU, as the majority of EU law does not apply to us. The provisions relating to the financial settlement do not affect us, as we do not contribute to, nor do we receive EU funds. And the impact of many of the other so-called separation issues is limited to the effects which we may feel because of our relationship with the UK. In other words, they may have an indirect effect only. The citizens' rights provisions are relevant to us. Essentially, the UK and the UK have agreed to protect the rights of citizens from each other's territories. This means that UK citizens who are resident in the EU on or before exit day, and this includes, therefore, the implementation period, which is currently up to the 31st of December 2020, and they would be allowed to remain and to accrue the right to permanent residence once they have been there for 5 years. This right is reciprocal, and so those EU citizens who take up residence in the UK, including the Crown dependencies, would also have the right to remain and to build up that 5-year residence, and therefore to remain beyond that point. Of course, it is the Irish border question which is more contentious, as the fallback position, or backstop, will come into effect after the 31st of December 2020 if the two sides have not arrived at a settled position which would prevent the creation of a hard border in Ireland by the 1st of July 2020. In other words, they have to have agreed their position on the border 6 months before the end of the implementation period. If there is no agreed or settled position by then, the backstop will be activated and the whole of the UK will remain in customs union with the European Union. And also some EU regulatory provisions will continue to apply to Northern Ireland in order to ensure that it remains in alignment with the rest of the EU. This is in order to avoid the need for customs or regulatory checks between Northern Ireland and Ireland. These provisions are set out in the withdrawal agreement and extend to some 100 pages. There is intense political debate in the UK as to how this would operate and how it would be brought to an end, with many concerned that it places too much power in the hands of the European Union. In addition, however, the UK also has the ability to make a one-off request to extend the length of the implementation period should it wish to do so. From an Isle of Man perspective, however, the extent to which the withdrawal agreement covers us is relatively limited. Article 3 of the agreement deals with the territorial scope, and it states that, quoting, "Unless otherwise provided in this agreement or in union law made applicable by this agreement, any reference in this agreement to the United Kingdom or its territory shall be understood as referring to the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man, to the extent that union law was applicable to them before the date of entry into force of this agreement." Mr. President, this limits, therefore, the extent to which the agreement applies to us to the scope of Protocol 3. In other words, our relationship would remain the same or very similar to that which we have now. We must remember, of course, that the withdrawal agreement is not in itself the deal, but a part of it. The deal could also be said to include the political statement on the future relationship, which ran only to 7 pages, and which sits alongside the withdrawal agreement. It is in that document that we see both sides setting out the high-level principles which will underpin their relationship going forward. This will guide the negotiations once they progress to Phase 2, that is, beyond the 29th of March 2019, when the UK becomes a third country. This statement does not contain any mention of territorial scope, and so we remain in close contact with the UK as the talks progress. Senior officials from the Isle of Man External Relations Directorate are in London today to meet with senior colleagues from the UK's Department for Exiting the EU and from the Channel Islands to begin consideration of some of the detail of the comprehensive documentation published last week. We know that although the withdrawal agreement has been concluded in draft, it is far from being agreed. The European Council, the British Parliament and the European Parliament must all agree the draft before it can come into effect. Mr. President, I would conclude this statement by summarising 2 key points. Firstly, that the withdrawal agreement, whilst having a limited direct effect on us, gives the clarity that we wanted and sought to achieve in terms of ensuring that the commitments the UK has made would only apply to us to the extent of Protocol 3. And secondly, I would also like to assure honourable members that we will continue to prepare for all eventualities, ensuring that we are prepared for a no-deal Brexit, as well as keeping abreast of the development of a new UK-EU relationship.